It is always a great privilege to be able to preach God's word. And let me tell you about a little trip that my wife and I took. We were warned, but we just didn't believe that they could be that bad, and they were worse than you could possibly imagine. In 2018, the summer, my wife Chris and I took a trip to Iceland, the land of fire and ice. And it's named that for the ongoing volcanic activity, the many glaciers that are on the island and the waterfalls, and it's sitting over the tectonic fissure between the European continent and the North American continent out there in the middle of the North Atlantic. And I heard that the country was full of beautiful natural wonders, a land of waterfalls and glaciers, and we wanted to see the handiwork of God upon the land and the waters of Iceland. And we arrived in the course of our trip. We drove most around what they call the ring road, which goes around the outside edge of Ireland. It's pretty difficult to drive into the interior because of the various, it's pretty rough territory in there with all of the volcanic activity and all. We arrived at a place on the north part of Iceland's route of the ring road, which is called Miva, after a long, hard day's drive. And I point this particular place out. It was an interesting place. It's a shallow lake of about 14 square miles located in that north central part of Iceland. And the name Miva is often used for the whole surrounding area that is inhabited. And you might say the entire population, that's one thing to keep in mind, of Iceland is I think about 350,000 people for the whole place, the whole nation. But the area there in Miva is rich with volcanic landforms, including lava pillars and what are called rootless vents or pseudo-craters. Those are not volcanic craters, but they are the result of gas, volcanic gas that comes up. And there is all sorts of geothermal activity, including boiling pools of mud, steaming fumarolas emitting sulfuric gas, quite noxious. And there's even several places where there are underground rivers of heated water. And there are also some dormant volcanoes that you can visit and see, and various formations which are kind of interesting to look at. And as you look at those volcanic formations and you see all sorts of different craters, none of these are active. The ones that we visited, they were not active. Some of the more active ones are in the interior. But the lake itself is not only surrounded with geological formations, but also with a lot of wildlife. The lake and its surrounding wetlands attract a large variety of water birds. In fact, it's considered one of Europe's, it is considered part of the European continent. It is considered one of the most bird-populated areas in all of Europe. Miva has a prodigious population of midges. In fact, we didn't actually find out until we were there that the name of the lake in Icelandic literally means Lake of the Midges. Now, midges are a group of insects that include and can include many kinds of different small flies, possibly what we would often call gnats. And we first heard the name used for gnats a few years before in Ireland, and we had to deal with them briefly a time or two there. And there were several resources that had recommended that if we were going to stay at Miva in that area, they warned us. And they warned us that we needed to take netting, head nets. And we didn't take the warning seriously, as I mentioned previously. I thought a few midges buzzing around our heads, it just won't justify the expense of a couple of dollars for a piece of head netting. Our second warning was when we arrived in the area. We arrived about 8:30 in the evening, and we wanted a place to eat. We'd been driving for most of the day, and we chose a nice restaurant close to the lake. In fact, you could see the lake from the restaurant. And the name of this, let's see, is it on there? You see it? The name of this place was called the Cowshed. And there was a reason why it was called the Cowshed. Because there's a glass window. This is from the restaurant. You're looking in through the glass window to the cows that are just right there on the other side of the window. And as you looked out, you can see it's some of the formations that are interesting there. But we parked in the parking lot, and we had to walk maybe 40 feet at most to the front door. And we got out of the car and we started to walk, and swarms of midges descended upon us. We could not take a step without waving our hands wildly in front of our faces to try to knock them away. That's how bad they were. And we're thinking, this is horrible. How is this going to happen? Now, if you notice, you see the place where the cowshed is over on this side with the big open door, and then there's a door over here, which I believe was open. Pretty sure it was open. And we thought, what are we going to do? How are we going to eat in this restaurant? And once we got inside the restaurant, we were kind of surprised because there were no midges inside the restaurant. They weren't bothering us. And we think, well, the door's open. How are they not in here? Well, we figured it out eventually because, as you can see, there were two walls that were a main part of the dining room that had floor-to-ceiling windows, bringing in plenty of natural light from outside. And we got seated at a table next to one of these windows. And I looked down into the seal of the window there, down almost at floor level, and then I saw where all the midges had gone. You see, the midges did make it inside, but they immediately went to the windows where the light was. And there they collected. There were hundreds inside the glass, apparently attracted to the outside light. And there was like a black mass at the bottom of the window. That was our third warning. The next day, we got in our car and we began to drive around the lake to see the many sights. And you can see here was one of the places. It was our first stop on the southern shore of the lake in an area called, I'm not even going to bother to pronounce it. We usually just give we just call it Scoot. If you talk Icelandic names, it was always a problem. But it had these pseudo craters, is what they called. And these pseudo craters are formed by gas explosions when boiling lava flowed over the wetlands, and it resulted in these sort of hills. And we pulled into the parking lot, and we noticed that there were a number of people who were walking around with head nets on. No problem. They're wimps. Who can't stand a few midges, So we decided to get out of the car, and you could see that there was a path there, and we're going to walk around these pseudo craters. And it was on our walk we finally began to get the message. You see, swarms of midges began dive bombing our faces, in our eyes, around our ears, our nose, our mouths, and waving your hands vigorously did not seem to stop them. Now, as I show you these pictures as we were on our walk, I want you to notice there's some blotches there on the camera? That's how many midges there were. Because as you see those little splotches, or those little black splotches, that's the midges flying by as I'm taking a picture. And Chris, we did happen to have what's called a buck, And it's like, well, let's pull them up over our nose and our mouth and sometimes even your eyes, because, you get that part and they buzz around your eyes. And as you look at these various pictures, as we're walking around, there's a big midge right there. And of course, for the one that you can see, there's 100 others that are swarming around. And we spent about 40 minutes, and occasionally a wind would come up, and if you had a good enough wind, they'd kind of blow them away, but it didn't last very long, and it was intermittently miserable to intolerable because of the clouds of the midges that besieged us. Well, I couldn't help but think about a story that I heard from a preacher. I'd read from a preacher in undergoing this, being besieged by midges. And the story was told by preacher Gary Henry. And he talked about, as a young man working for a road construction company that was rebuilding South Highway 90 along the Mississippi Gulf Coast following the devastation of Hurricane Camille in the previous summer. And he talks about the long work days that began about daybreak, and without even a hint of breeze down there on the southern Gulf Coast, and the waters of the Gulf of Mexico as still as a sheet of glass, and the freshness of those mornings would have been enjoyable had it not been for the gnats. And as Gary describes it, he said, down there, anyone foolish enough to come near a sandy beach early summer mornings is going to be attacked by the plague of gnats, which in Iceland they call midges. And so small that you can hardly see them. And gnats that bite with a torment that is all out of proportion to their size. We were fortunate. The midges weren't biters. They were just irritants. But by mid-morning, they disappeared. But the first few hours of the day make a grown man cry. And then Gary talked about a man that he worked with. He said the man was Joe Bridges. He said, a grizzled old black man who would watch out for the young men working on the job, and became a dear friend from Tylertown, Mississippi. He'd been a common laborer for many years, followed construction jobs all over the South. And Gary marveled at the patient, rhythmic way he worked under very difficult conditions. And the morning of the gnats was no exception. As a young man furiously fighting the gnats and saying unappreciative things about the day he was born, Joe Bridges just seemed to take only slight notice of the devilish little insects. And finally, Gary said, man, how in the world can you stand this? Don't these gnats bother you? And Joe said, well, I guess they would if I let them. Yeah. And that's what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about the midges, the gnats, and the other irritations that we find in life. And the first thing that I want to tell you is it can be difficult, but don't let the midges bother you. Don't let the gnats bother you. Do we let the gnats and the other small annoyances get to us and bother us, distract us and derail us? There was a book written a number of years ago about avoiding this dangerous trap. It was entitled, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And then, of course, I think one of the subtitles, I don't know if on this book, it's all small stuff. In other words, there are folks that have known what real hardship is, and they don't pay much attention to the gnats. And the Lord told us in the Sermon on the Mount that we should not be worried about even the most basic needs of life. And he said, therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, what you will drink, or about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow, nor they reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you of not more value than they? And which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature? So why do you worry about clothing? And consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, and yet I say to you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Now, if God clothes the grass of the field, which today is, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Therefore, do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For after all these things the Gentiles seek. Your heavenly Father knows that you need all of these things. But, hit the wrong button here. But, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. You know, Jesus here tells us to take the stuff that we call major and put it into the small stuff category. You know, don't we think and don't we worry about how are we going to get food? How are we going to eat? What are we going to wear? What about tomorrow? He says, don't worry about it. Don't sweat it. Life and food and drink and body and clothes and what's going to happen tomorrow? Why shouldn't we not sweat it? Why should we not worry about these things? He says, because God will take care of you. God knows that you need these things. And we think about all of the things in life and that God will provide for us. Lay aside the bothersome distractions and irritations. God will take care of me. Stop and think. In Luke, the 8th chapter, in verse 14, there Jesus in the parable where he talks about the sower, he talks about the idea of there are certain things in life that can choke with cares and bring no fruit to maturity. And the gnats in life, the irritations in life, often will choke out the word in our lives if we allow those distractions, those small irritations, those cares to choke it, if we give our attention to it. We also read as he goes on in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, and there it tells us, therefore we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witness, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Look at there. Lay aside every weight and run. Imagine all the obstacles that one might have to overcome if they were going to walk from one end of the country to the other. There was one man who accomplished walking from New York City to San Francisco, and it was a rare achievement. Get it out. And he was asked about the difficulty. What was his biggest hurdle? And he said, you know, the toughest part of the trip wasn't traversing the steep slopes of the mountains. It wasn't crossing the hot, dry, barren stretches of desert. Instead, he said, the thing that came the closest to defeating me was the sand in my shoes. And so it is with you and I. Oftentimes, it's the smallest things that bother us that can ultimately defeat us. So the next thing that I want you to think about is no matter, you know, you're not always going to be able to get rid of and deal with the gnats and the midges and the irritations. And so be content regardless of the irritations, regardless of the midges. You can't often change your circumstances, but you can always change your attitude. And that's what the Lord teaches us time and again in his word. Paul wrote to Philippians 4 and verses 11 and 12, not that I speak with regard to need, for I have learned that in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things, I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and suffer need. And so, Paul, again writing, tells us further, go to the next slide. Pardon me, I have my pages mixed up there. Before, the movie companies were careful about various languages, foreign languages that they had in film, and assuming that no one in the United States would understand, there was a movie that was made about African tribe, and the director, that it was being filmed in Africa, needed an African message who was to run a great distance, and then he was supposed to gasp out a sentence to the big chief, and then in the dramatic he would collapse after delivering his message. And in the movie, and the way that it played out, that since he had run for days with his vital news, according to the way the movie played out, a local Englishman who spoke Swahili was asked to write an urgent-sounding sentence in the language, and he did tongue-in-cheek. And an American actor played the part beautifully. And all went well until the movie was shown in Nairobi that spoke Swahili. And the drama of the moment was reduced to high comedy when the messenger actually said in Swahili, which nobody in the U.S. would have known, actually said, and he threw himself exhausted before the chief, and he said this, I do not think I'm getting paid enough money for this part. Don't worry. Be content. Be content with what you have, right? In 1 Timothy 6 and verses 6 through 8, it says, now godliness with contentment is great gain. We can be upset and irritated and agitated at all sorts of things, but contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. It was Benjamin Franklin who made the comment, content makes poor men rich. Discontent makes rich men poor. And of course, the scriptures tell us that we are casting all our care upon him, for he cares for you. There's a third lesson that we should learn from the Midges, and that is you realize it doesn't matter how irritable you get. The midges aren't going to go away because you're irritable. And that's true with any kind of irritation. If it's an irritation that you can't do anything about, you being irritable about the irritation doesn't change it. It won't make it stop. One measure of a man is the size of what it takes to annoy him. And unfortunately, most of us are far too easily irritated. Maybe we don't have enough character, and it doesn't take much to get the best of us, and consequently our lives are dominated by relatively minor vexations, things that wisdom says that we shouldn't take the time to be troubled about. And we're a victim of every little unpleasantness that comes along. Rather than grow in character and rise above the petty annoyances, we spend our lives swatting at the gnats, and still they're there. And the real work we were sent to do ends up being neglected because we've spent our time and our energy being annoyed, being irritated, being irritable. I'd heard this, my father preached this many years ago and used this expression, I had no shoes and complained until I met a man who had no feet. The tendency to be easily annoyed is far more than a quirky little personality trait. I would suggest that many of the quite serious problems in life especially when we deal with other people, boil down to the failure to discipline ourselves regardless and with regard to the basic issue of irritability. If not repented of and removed from our character, annoyance is likely to be more deadly than we expect. And the bad habits of going from irritable to being just downright grouchy to being somebody that nobody wants to be around. And we find ourselves upset over the midges and the gnats and the other annoyances, and our hearts are wide open to all sorts of evil things. What do I mean? Well, whoever has no rule over his own spirit, Proverbs 25 and verse 28 says, it's like a city broken down without walls. And when we allow the minor irritations, the small gnats, to bother us, we become defenseless, unprotected from the real threats and the temptations to our soul. And it's the small things that seem to swarm and overwhelm us. And the small things, the minor distractions, the little irritations, the trifling habits that collect like dead midges on a Miva windowsill. And there they are, ugly for all the world to see. Remember, the minor distractions would include the cares of this world, which will choke out and make the word unfruitful. The cares of this world, doesn't that qualify? Those cares, those seeming annoyances, those irritations, those little irritations include the foibles and follies of others that drive us to unloving thoughts, acts of impatience, unkindness, envy, pride, rudeness, selfishness, irritability, and evil surmising. And you thought it was just a midge, right? Or a cloud of midges. And then we find out that our soul and our heart are opened up to all sorts of evil. You see, the remedy to this is love. Because love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked easily, and thinks no evil. Trifling habits are the careless ways, the ruts we travel without thinking, and the corrupt companions that we choose to travel with. And so the remedy to that is to realize that being irritable will not make that go away. We need to understand, move through here, not only will being irritable not make the midges go away. And someone might say, well, then you want me to be pleasant? That's no solution. Well, yeah, being pleasant isn't going to make the midges go away either. You can be as pleasant as you want and you still got the gnats, right? You still got those irritations. But you know what? It'll certainly make you a better person. Oh, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and the dwarfs go off to prepare for work, and being in a mine is not the best place to work. And yet they're whistling while they work. They're making the best of that. Instead of going off to work all grumpy, well, except for grumpy, they're going to go off and whistle while they work. And so, likewise, we should live our life in that way. And to realize that he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. And the discretion of a man makes him slow to anger and to overlook a transgression. Not going to be ready to jump. We're going to be pleasant. We're going to be loving. Have a fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. 1 Peter 4 and verse 8. And I keep hitting the wrong button there. And of course, remember, when we have love, love is not easily provoked. It is a necessary part of being a Christian and serving the Lord. And so, let your gentleness be known to all men. The word translated gentleness has been defined as strength under control. It takes strength to to not let the irritations get to you. It takes love to be patient and loving and gentle. Avoid the destructive effects of being annoyed with the irritations, the small things in life. Our strength must be under control. Our spirit must be under control. And we do this, we need to be disciplined and wise with the wisdom that comes from God. And when things seem irritating and upsetting and well, then we think about what James says. It says, don't have bitter envy and self-seeking in your heart. And instead, Paul says in Philippians 4 and verses 6 and 9, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. And then, as he goes on here, he says, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, noble, just, pure, lovely, of good report, if there's any virtue, if there be any praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Make you a better person. There are plenty of midges and gnats and other irritations. I don't have to tell you, you face them every day, right? And you need to realize that those little irritations, it just takes a little bit to really get into you. Affect the whole lump, affect the whole soul. As dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment, and so does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. If you fail to take care of the little things and allow them to take control of you, it will affect your entire life. I love this beautiful saying in the Song of Solomon. It says, catch us the foxes, the little foxes that spoil the vines, for our vines have tender grapes. You got to take care of the little things. Don't let the little things spoil your fruit. The minor irritations, the annoyances, don't let them ruin your day. Don't let them ruin your character. And to prevent this spoiling of your character, you need to tend your own vineyard. Be watchful, be diligent, and catch those little foxes before they become big nuisances and destroy your crop. Well, I need to tell you the rest of the story. Last I left you off in the middle of that story was there we were besieged by midges. And we were walking out and Chris said, she got back to the car after our quick walk, and she said, I'm not going anyplace else until we get a head net. And you know what? I had to agree with her. I said, okay. So we took about 20 minutes to drive to the nearest small supermarket. It says supermarket, but that was a pretty small supermarket. And we paid the confiscatory price of $12 for 2 head nets. And there they are, along with some sweets. And so the end of the story was, with this simple overpriced bag of fine mesh, the midges had met their match. And so we were able to enjoy the rest of our trip there in Meva. That wasn't all of Iceland, by the way, just Meva, the Midge Lake. And so don't ever forget, don't let the midges bother you. Be content regardless of the midges. Being irritable isn't going to make them go away. Being pleasant won't make them go away either. But you'll be better for it. And it'll make you a better person in the long run.